As you can see from the film, Crystal Kwok dares to ask the many provocative questions in her documentary. What can we learn from the past to ensure a better future? We have assembled an excellent panel to do a deep dive not only into the issues raised by the film, but also the often uncomfortable and rarely addressed subject of how Asian and Black American people get along, both historically and in the present. Our panelists, where's Crystal? Come, start the show. I didn't know you speak Cantonese so good. The filmmaker and director, Vivian, diversity leadership trainer and expert. Dr. Adria Welcher, Morehouse College sociologist. And our moderator, Justice Carla Wong McMillian of the Georgia Supreme Court. A few ground rules, please. Our goal is to have a powerful, candid, unapologetic conversation, but always respectful. We save 15 minutes for audience Q&A. Please use the mics on the side, on either side. If you have a question, come up during that session to ask your questions. We are another ground rule, we are strictly prohibited from discussing the Atlanta Spar shootings or the Ahmaud Arbery murder, because these cases will likely come up before the Georgia Supreme Court, before our justice, okay? So let's be very respectful of that. Again, no talking about the Spar shooting. So, Justice McMillian.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here today on a beautiful Saturday afternoon to talk about some of these very important issues. So I'd like to start out by having the panelists introduce themselves briefly, and I'll start with an introduction of myself. I'm Carla McMillian. I'm a justice on the Georgia Supreme Court. But for this event, I think it's more important that I actually grew up in the Chinese community in Augusta. Crystal and I are cousins, so many of the interviewees that you saw are people that I grew up with. Many of them are my family members. So this is a very personal project to me as well. So panelists, if you could introduce yourselves.
Well, good afternoon. It is a joy to be with you all this afternoon. I am Dr. Adria Welcher. I'm an associate professor and the chair of the Department of Sociology at Morehouse College, as well as the director of general education. I, too, am from Augusta. Now, I didn't have any family members in the video, but there were some very familiar names, people with whom I've known for many, many years. So this story was very personal to me because I was able to take my sociological hat onto something that I didn't understand as a child, these sort of interpersonal relationships, and how they relate to the structure. So very, very excited to engage with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I guess you know I'm Crystal, and I'm Carla's cousin, and I didn't know that until I started embarking on this project, which is crazy. What's even crazier is my other cousin, I just realized is in the audience, Leanne, who's in the film, is somebody I didn't even know existed because of these erasures of histories for whatever reason. So Leanna, thank you for being here. So as I, I'm not going to say too much now, but I live in Hawaii. I have 3 kids who grew up and were born in Hong Kong, so I come from a transnational perspective on these race issues because it's not just a Southern issue. It is a global, international issue of colorism and race relations that we need to address here. So I'm so just privileged to be here. Thank you.
Great. All right, let's make sure it's on. Hi, my name is Vivian. I am the president and CEO of Basic Diversity. We are the nation's longest serving diversity consulting firm. We do work all over, but we're best known for our 2-day race seminar, which has been evaluated as the most effective race relations seminar in existence, 86 to 94% effectiveness.
All right, thank you for the introduction. So I think we're just going to jump in. to the discussion. And the first question is for Crystal. You alluded to this in your previous introduction, but this project took you many years to complete and started with a very different focus. Can you share a little bit about the backstory and tell us how this project turned into an exploration of a relationship between the African American and Chinese American community?
Sure. I'll try to keep that simple and short and sweet, but I was very close to my grandmother, and it came from a very personal place. I had intentions of just doing a story about these unruly Chinese women in the South who resisted structures. That was the original title of my film, by the way, Unruly Chinese Women. But as I progressed in the editing of it, Black Lives Matter happens, right? And so it really shifted me off course, and I realized there was a larger force I needed to embrace and confront. And but then in that process, I felt like I was losing my voice. I come from a point where I love to situate the women's stories, and how does a woman's lens speak to the racism and the Black Lives Matter situation, but lo and behold, the anti-Asian hate crimes surfaced, right? So I'm grappling with a couple of very large movements that have shifted our narrative around racism. And so to your point, Carla, is I had to pull back the personal stories, and it morphed into what it is today. And if it didn't, I guess we wouldn't be here today to talk about these issues. And how does a small story of these untold histories speak to a larger truth that we're all grappling with today is something that I think is important to recognize. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Adria, let's follow up on that. The film exposes a lot of prejudice held by the Chinese community against African Americans, even though the communities live side by side in Augusta. On the other end of the spectrum, nowadays people like to argue that they're not prejudiced because they don't see color. They're colorblind. And they treat everybody the same. But being colorblind can actually be counterproductive. So can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Gladly. Thank you. So when we say colorblind, it sounds really good, right? It's the idea that I don't see color, so I can't be prejudiced towards you, or I cannot discriminate against you. When in actuality, if we don't see color, we're denying who you are. Because when you walk into a room, I size you up, right? So we can look at it from a psychological perspective and schemas and how we make sense of the world, or we can look at it from a sociological perspective, right? But when you walk into a room, I make a series of assumptions about you based on your phenotype. Inherent in that phenotype is your color. So for us to say that I am colorblind is really dishonoring the heritage, all of the culture and the value and the beauty that you bring into a room with you. So it's better for us to understand that by saying that we're colorblind, it's really problematic, because then I don't see you. So it's the opposite of what we think it says, right? And I'm trying to it's a little dark out there, so I'm teaching you like I teach my class. I need to see the nods. I need, in the African American tradition, the call and response, I need to hear yes, or nods. Thank you. So with that in mind, we have to be very mindful that when we see the color, we don't make the assumptions then that lead to the prejudiced and discriminatory behavior, right? So it's not about seeing color. It's about what we do with that color when we see it, right?
Thank you. And Al, in the film, several African American interviewees talked about how they felt that the Chinese were trying to align themselves with the white community, and there was a tension. There's definitely a tension there. So in your opinion, and based on your research and your work that you've done, is this a prevalent view among African Americans today? And how do African Americans view Asian Americans today? As friends or foes? As a stereotypical model minority? Or something else? Hard question.
I guess if I were to choose one of those categories, I would say the or something else. Not necessarily friend or foe, but definitely more privileged than we are, past and present. And so something the African American community has always been really good at, because on that color hierarchy, we were always seen as at the bottom. Because in America and throughout the world, the darker you are, the worse you tend to get treated. And so as a result, we are pretty good at sizing people up. So we look at different groups and try to figure out where do they picture us, and that determines how we view them. And so the privilege piece, as Crystal just clearly made real obvious in the movie, which was really great, and that is that Asians had privileges that we didn't. You know, they could still go to the white schools, they could still drink from the white water fountains, so they were allowed a much better education and other things that we were not allowed to have. And so we see the Asian community as different, and so we're always trying to figure out where do we fit with them and where do they fit with us.
Yeah, great. So the next question is for Crystal, and this film really started as an exploration of Chinese women, unruly Chinese women. But now the film also talks about race and gender and how your grandmother and her sisters were forced to marry other Chinese and were prohibited from fraternizing with African Americans, much less marry them. But on the other hand, the Chinese families had maids in the house, African American maids in the house. Based on your research, where does this racism and gender bias come from, and how do those negative attitudes get reinforced?
Oh, I get the hard question.
All of these questions are hard.
Well, I'm not a history expert. I know some of you are in the audience, but I can, based on my research and what I've seen is, and to speak to the term blurring, because I think that we need to entangle. It's not just one thing or the other, right? You have to complicate it by including the ideas of gender, race, class, all of that. It's all part of the same kind of complex fabric of what this country is built on. And to speak to that, I think that's where it comes from. You know, how was racism built? I mean, race, as you learn in school, is a construct, but what does that really mean? It means that somebody created this idea of this white power in the central, and everything that's not that is othered. And that's everyone else. And then it pits us all against each other, and defining, again, to your point about the colorism and the proximity to whiteness and why everything is gauged around what's defined in the middle. And I feel like that's where the whole structure, and I don't want to go into that, but one person that I screened my film in Hong Kong, and one lady says, well, where are the white people in your film? You're talking about this relationship between black and white, and so where? And my argument for that is that it is the premise of my film. If I didn't have this white central power that existed, we wouldn't have these conversations today. And so it is everything. It's not the shark in the water, it's the water. And we need to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you.
That's real good.
And just following up on that, Adria, you've done a lot of research into race and class inequalities, and that was alluded to in the film too, the anti-miscegenation laws, the segregated schools. I mean, there was a lot of, in the legal background during the segregated South that contributed to the divide of the Asian American and African American communities. Can you discuss that a little bit more? And particularly, if you could talk about segregated schools and how Augusta was not the norm necessarily with that, please.
Absolutely. Now, I will also give the disclaimer that I am a sociologist, not a historian nor a political scientist, but I am familiar with a number of these laws. And so just allow me a little bit of levity here. So when we think about sort of nationally, right, there was a wave of Chinese immigration to the United States as a part of the gold rush, right, under this notion of, hey, we're coming in search of getting money, hitting the jackpot, right? So we often think of this sort of Western sort of influx of Chinese Americans, right? Well, as folks were coming initially, it was received as a positive thing, right? Because, well, we need as many people to go and find this gold, but eventually it became a threat to this white power structure, right? And so the way that we speak about it sociologically is ethnic competition theory, right? So the more ethnic groups that are here, we're all competing for the same spaces, right? Because we have the whites who are sort of in the middle, as you mentioned earlier, Crystal, like they're the norm, right? But everybody else is competing to be in second place, right? Or maybe third place, or maybe at some point we can get close enough to be first place, right? So this notion that as Chinese came, at first it was a good thing, Chinese and other Asian immigrants as well, right? But it was, and let me also pause there. When we look at this sort of Asian story, we have to be very mindful to not talk about it as a pan-ethnic story, because every country has its own history, its own reason for immigration, who was allowed to come, who was prevented from coming. So when we look at the Chinese experience, they came with the gold rush. Initially it was good. Then the women were not allowed to continue to come into the country, right? Because Chinese women had been hypersexualized, they were perceived as bad people. So, but the men are still here. And linked to that, we have these anti-miscegenation laws that says, well, Chinese men, you can't marry non-Asian folks. So we see Chinese men intermingling with other Asians, but it was illegal by law to mingle with non-Asian folks, right? So I'm sort of trying to build the history. So the Page Act, which is what prevented the women from immigrating into the country, was shortly followed by the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that was, and it's interesting because we're seeing some vestiges of this today, right? That limited immigration into the country. Now, mind you, none of this was happening with European countries. None of this was happening with European countries. So it wasn't about, whoa, we are full, there's no room. It was about, we are full for people like you, right? And that's a very important distinction to make, right? And so then shortly after, we had the Scott Act that said, well, if you're here and you leave, you can't come back, right? So all of this national legislation led to folks really fighting for space, fighting for competition, fighting to proliferate, to allow their families to grow and live. And I think it's extremely important that we understand the structural nature of this discrimination. This is legislation that we're talking about. It's not somebody just calling up their homeboy and saying, hey, I think we ought to close the gates, right? These are policies that are put in place, and they're put in place intentionally. So the second part of your question that I think is very important is that the way that it was handled in Augusta was unique. Because in most cases, Chinese were not allowed into white spaces as freely back then. Now, of course, it's different, right, over time. But the fact that the Chinese students were allowed to attend white schools in this segregated economy was very unique. Now, I mean, just think about it, and they talked about it, and it's funny because I actually graduated from Davidson Fine Arts High School, and, you know, and my brother went to C.T. Walker. So when he saw, I was like, I know where those schools are. You had to leave there. But it was living in the black community, driving through your community to go to these white schools. So that was very unique because in most cases, the Chinese and most immigrants, right, who were not Anglo-Saxon immigrants, most immigrants had this sort of experience where they were not invited into the white space.
Even the Jews and the Italians were also in the black
Absolutely.
neighborhood.
That's right. That's right. And Irish, right? We have countless stories. And if we don't teach this history, which is why I think this conversation is so important, they're not necessarily teaching it in schools, particularly where there's an attack now on taking out this sort of accurate and appropriate history. They're not teaching it. So these conversations are critically important to ensure that we, one, have the truth, and then two, that we tell the truth. So I hope that I answered that and didn't take too long looking at you. Okay.
Great. And I mean, I just want to add to that from a legal background, because I think a lot of Asian Americans don't appreciate that Asian Americans were not allowed to go into the white schools in the rest of the South, pretty much. In Mississippi, there was a famous case that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. There was a Mississippi law that prohibited Chinese children, Asian children, from attending the white schools. It was challenged by a Chinese family, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, a case called Gong Lum versus Rice in 1927. And the U.S. Supreme Court, now mind you, this is 1927, way after Plessy versus Ferguson. And the U.S. Supreme Court cited Plessy versus Ferguson and said, nope, the Asians are prohibited, can be prohibited from going to the white schools, separate but equal. So, I mean, it's just something that is not really talked about today. So thank you so much for sharing, Adria. Going to the next question, Al, the laws have changed, thankfully, but Asian Americans and African Americans continue to be underrepresented in positions of power and authority, for example, corporate boards, judges, and similar positions. So what's it going to take to get Asian Americans a seat at the table? Are there enough seats at the table, and are we going to be competing and getting pitted against one another for that privilege? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so we've always been pitted against each other from the dawn of time. And that is also by design, and it was also done with policy and with law to make sure it stayed that way, which is why it's still that way. And so when you mentioned the piece about the laws and policies, and we're still seeing some of that now. I mean, that is now the attack on schools teaching real history, because I always say we don't get taught American history, we get taught American mythology. We don't get the reality of who we are, because if we were to start to teach that, then the next generation could see it coming when it came again. But because they don't get taught that, they don't see it coming. So it's just repackaged doing the same thing. So the laws have always been changed. They continue to change. I would also add the piece, and I might get your question off because I love the question. There were so many pieces to it. The pitted against each other, the laws always changing. Oh, come on. What else did you ask me about? I'm having a brain cramp.
What's it going to take to get
What's it gonna take to make
Asian Americans to get a seat at the table?
Thank you. Forcefulness. The polite, take it easy, avoid it. That was semi-successful in the past, but I don't think that's going to work for the future. The beauty is, I think the younger Asian generation gets that and are more willing to push a little bit, as I think that they should. Every peoples deserve a voice in the society, and they've not had a voice. None of us have really had a voice, but our numbers were larger. Asians' numbers are growing faster, but still the smaller of the groups. But I think that they're going to start pushing more and more, and I think that's needed to happen. And there are always enough seats at the table.
Well, I don't know. There may not be enough, but I think you create your own table if you don't have that seat. Because why should you go? Because that reinforces the system. Like, okay, you can come to my table. But I think we have to dismantle that idea of who has a table. You know, it's about reframing how we sit.
I don't think it's either or. I think it's an and both. We should create our own seats at their table, and we should create our own tables, because none of us should be limited. In a nation that says we're all entitled to the same rights and freedoms, we shouldn't have to wait our turn. We shouldn't have to beg to get a seat. We should be able to take that seat if we have the ability to get that seat. And if we really were a true democracy, it would have already happened. You know, we would look like the demographic numbers.
Yeah, I just want to echo that, because I wouldn't be in this position today that I'm in if I didn't put myself out there. And the thing is, I mean, I was the first Asian American to be elected to statewide office in Georgia, the first one, which is great for me. But why did it take till 2014 for that to happen? So.
Carla, can you share a little bit? I know this may be off topic, but the fact that we are cousins from our grandmother, great-grandmother, you mentioned earlier about this interesting distinction about how we go from our past and how the mothers instill certain values that contribute to what our version of success is.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So just the relationship between Crystal and I, or Crystal's great-grandmother and my grandmother were sisters. So we're cousins on two different lines. Crystal's family, they married their daughters off. There was really a gender segregation within that family. My family was very different. My Aunt Margaret was encouraged to go to college by my grandmother, who's a sister to Crystal's great-grandmother. Encouraged to go to college. She went to Mercer University, encouraged to go to medical school, went to MCG and graduated from MCG in 1946, and was the first Chinese-American woman to graduate with an MD in the Southeast. I mean, very different paths.
Yeah, mine got stuck in bad marriages.
And from the same family. And so Crystal and I talked about why there was such a difference. And I know that Crystal's great-grandmother, I think, was the older sister. My grandmother was the younger sister. I don't know if there was any difference in how they were raised. I think there was somewhat of an age difference. But still, very different paths that our families took in terms of how they treated their daughters. And I'm the result of that today. I really believe I am. So the next question is for Crystal and Adria. Dr. King famously said that it is appalling that the most segregated hour of Christian America is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. Yep. In the film, Crystal references the First Baptist Church of Augusta, which, by the way, was my home church. I grew up in that church. That church supported the Chinese community and protected the Chinese in a way. On the other hand, Adria, you're very familiar with that church and the racist views that church took against the African American community. Can you each discuss how religion has been used to divide our communities in the past and today?
I'm going to let you take the hard one, but I just...
We're raising the mic.
No, not me, not me. But I just wanted to mention that scene in the film was probably, in my opinion, one of the most uncomfortable scenes. And it's not because of what they say, it's what they don't say.
That's right.
Right? The
Asians
subtle
are
nod.
silent.
And I heard it in the audience.
Yeah.
There was some feedback on that. And that just said so much. Right? I don't have to explain it. I think it showed itself. So please.
Well, I will say most First Baptists in the South were very racist spaces.
Yeah.
I want to say that. And as a sidebar, my husband is now the pastor of a First Baptist that was white. It is no longer. Everybody's welcome, of course. But it's no longer a white church. So First Baptist Church of Augusta is the home of the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, if you know the history, and I'm not a theologian, so you all just work with me, the Southern Baptist Convention was created in response to integration, right? So the idea that if you are a slave owner, you will be able, or a proponent if you're a proponent of segregation, excuse me, you will be able to assume leadership in this conference. Right. So that's why the Southern Baptist Convention was created, because they supported the segregation. So First Baptist Church of Augusta, the one that we just saw in the video, that was so loving and welcoming, according to them, to the Chinese Americans, right, was the exact same place. Now, and you know, Southern Baptist has made history recently for some other unsavory things. Yes. Right? But we're talking about a place that was created to support segregation, to support the disenfranchisement of black people. Right? And so when you look at that history, if we were just to listen, right, to not take the sounds from the crowd, to not sort of ask the deeper question and do a deeper dive, but so they're welcoming this group, yet they're creating organizations that will keep us out. Right, and then of course historically, and I don't know that this would be documented. We'd really have to get some historians to go through some primary documents to get this information. But historically, the same folks who were leaders at First Baptist Church of Augusta were leaders in the government of Augusta. They were leaders on the school boards of Augusta. They were making other decisions that impacted the livelihood of all the communities, not excluding the African American community. So when I saw that in the video, and this sort of happened in our debrief, I was like, well, that's very interesting, because that's not how they treated the black folks in Augusta. But when we talk about sort of the relationship between these two groups, these institutions are part of that framing. Why is it okay for them to attend and not us? Why is it okay for them to have businesses in our community and not us? Right. And I'll stop there before I get another sign from Jimmy.
Anything, Crystal?
No, I know we're cramped for time, so I'll let you carry on.
Well, I'll go ahead and I'll ask the next question for Al. And the next couple questions are really trying to bring everything together to how we can apply some of the things that we've learned today going forward. So Al, we've talked a lot about our differences, but can you explain why it's important for Asian Americans to be allies of the African American community and other people of color? What do we stand to lose if we don't, and what are the potential benefits?
We stand to lose survival, relevance, and wherewithal if we don't come together. All of us, blacks, Latinos, Asians, Arabs, to include whites, if we don't become inclusive, we'll all become irrelevant. Our demographics are changing so massively that if we do not all learn to coalesce with one another, we're just not going to make it. And by the way, the rest of the world will be passing us by, as actually they already are. We just haven't realized it. We're so busy fighting each other that we can't really accomplish it. It took over a decade to get an infrastructure bill passed. I mean, just let that sink in. We can't even fix roads and bridges because we're busy fighting each other over stuff.
You should see the roads in Hawaii.
Oh, you should see the roads in Detroit. You want to see some potholes? You're gonna lose a car in a pothole in Detroit. I mean, it's a bloop. I mean, where to go? You know, it's gone. But it's all of that. We need to be working together. What do we have to gain from that? One, there's power in numbers. Two, we learn from each other. Three, more productivity, more creativity, more innovation. Study after study proves that more diversity creates all of that. and all the research has been done in businesses to prove it as well. 60% improvement on decision making, 1.7 times percent improvement on, you name it. It's everything improves when we're working together. And those who choose to separate will do so at their own peril. But if we're working together, we have more power in numbers, and that's very important.
Thank you. And Crystal and Adria, what ideas or advice would you suggest for promoting Black and Asian solidarity? And are solidarity and allyship the same thing?
These are words. I feel like people who claim allyship or solidarity, it doesn't mean anything unless you take action. But what does it mean to take action? I think that's the harder question. Because you just check off that, oh, I have one Black friend, does not do it, right? And in my experience in this process, to dig deep, especially I would say intergenerational conversations are vital. It is something we don't do enough of. We don't even know what our parents and grandparents did. Ask your parents or grandparents what they did to sneak out, or because I tell you, those intimate histories are going to inform you more about history than you do learn in school. My approach is through intimate histories. It is a way of resisting dominant structures because these are not recorded in dominant narratives. And these personal stories, oral histories, memories, which again, larger structures refuse because they think it's ambiguous and kind of tainted, but it is much more revealing of our past. And I think if we can embrace that and to, more importantly, reframe our history through our own truthful stories. So I really, if I had one thing I could encourage you all to do is to speak to intergenerational parties within your community, and to, if you are creatives, if you're storytellers, tell more stories that create new narratives, because the media just loves to take all this stuff and pit us against each other. So if we create new narratives that normalize our conversations and our connective histories and the beautiful and ugly moments, then I think we can go somewhere with this. Yeah, thank you.
I agree, and I also think it's important that we start with ourselves. So we have to be very honest about our own biases.
Because we've all got them.
We have them.
Yep.
And it's not pretty, it doesn't feel good, but we have to own them because we can't confront them if we don't acknowledge them. And so this notion of self-reflection, I think, is critically important. And whether that happens just you in a mirror, talking to yourself, or if you need to do it with a team or with families, but you have to start with owning your own biases, right? And the histories that come along with those. And then I would say that the next step is to be very intentional about stepping outside of your comfort zone. I, too, am guilty of this. I work at Morehouse. It's a mecca of beautiful Black male bodies that I get to be with all the time, just beautiful Blackness. And I have to be very conscious to not get too comfortable in that Black space, because it is important that I reach across the aisle. It is important that I step outside of the block. And this space is fantastic, and so I don't just want us to smile and nod and be like, yep, what she said, and then walk out of here. Because we felt good in that moment, but what have we really done to push the needle? Right? What have we done to advance the conversation? And I think that it's going to take the people like us, right, who get that it's important, who get that it's time for a change, to own our stuff and partner so that we can create these new tables, right, and move forward. And the way that I do this is in my classrooms. One of my students, Brother Bouye, is in the back, and so he knows that I really push my students to think outside. We're uncomfortable a lot of times.
Yeah.
Right? Because we have to be in this space of discomfort before we're really able to grow, right? I mean, think about what we do with our children, right? Get on the bike. I know you failed. Get back up there. That discomfort is a part of how we get better. And we have to be able to get better.
And dare to step outside of your comfort zone. Asians, we love it. We just like, okay, stay in our box. It's safer.
Well, I love the part in the video when you're talking about the pig's feet, right? Because I remember my grandma having that big jar of pink pickled pig's feet. I said, I know where those are from.
Did you eat it? Growing up?
I
How
did.
many people ate pickled pig feet?
They were good. I don't eat pork anymore, but woo-woo, as a kid, as a child, I would love a Grandma Glenda's would. When we see it coming out, and chitlins as well. Okay, I'm done. I know that's a...
Yes,
Got
we've
the
had
best
chitlins
collagen,
before
so
my
please
family too.
eat it.
So.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, thank you so much. And before we solicit questions from the audience, Crystal, you have some exciting news to share about the documentary. So go ahead.
Thank you, and I keep forgetting this, so thank you for reminding me, Justice. So yes, I'm very happy and excited to announce that our film is picked up by PBS, and we'll be showing, it will be in May. the big launch date is May 11th. So any of you who have family or friends who want to say, hey, where can I see it? But for better or for worse, you got the original version. The one on PBS is going to be shorter version. So yeah, aw, yeah. So, but at least it's out there and we can share it and we can create new conversations. So May 11th, remember that, and please share with your friends. Thank you for asking.
Yay.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions, and if you have a question, if you could please step up to the microphones on either side in the aisles and
Eager
to
hands.
ask.
So yes, please come, talk, please.
Well, first of all, what an amazing documentary.
Yes, yes, yes.
And what I'm struck by is how we see history continuing to repeat itself.
Yep.
The Augusta race riots, I'd only heard very glancingly about that, but I had not known the depth of the destruction there. And also, I want to talk about how becoming allies and accomplices with the Black community is so important, because Asian Americans, and in fact all people of color, benefit from the fight of Black Americans for civil rights in this country. People like your father, C.T. Vivian, Congressman John Lewis. Asian Americans would not be here fighting and having seats at the table or creating their own tables without the struggles of Black Americans. So one of the uncomfortable conversations in the movie, in addition to the First Baptist one, was, I think, with your daughter, and talking about what her perception was of what Chinese Americans or Asian Americans thought of the Black community. And oftentimes, I'm Korean American, and first-generation Korean Americans, such as my parents, often talk very derogatorily about Black people. And I think the lack of education or the lack of knowledge about how the histories of Black struggle in America have benefited Asian Americans and lifted all boats has been missing, especially among the education of first generation, maybe even up to second generation immigrant families. So I guess my question to you is, I could see it in a little bit in your conversations with your family members, the older Chinese American women from Augusta. Did you start to see or feel them in their heads changing? Oh, wait a minute, maybe I really was racist, or I grew up racist. And how do you have those conversations in a way that you can see some productive results?
Thank you for that question. And I'm going to keep it short because I want to honor all of your questions, and maybe we can keep like several minutes for each person. I want to include them all. To be honest, I don't think it changed much. When you're fixed in your way of thinking, it's very hard to change that. But what it did was it opened up for me to be able to engage that part into a larger dialogue of how that came to be and what do we need to do to change that. And that is the biggest question. And I think we all need to ask each other ourselves on that question. Thank you.
All right, thank you. If you could go to this side.
Hi, my name is Denise Low. I was so happy to meet somebody really from Hong Kong, because I'm from Hong Kong. And I think you understand, right? I think we're almost the same age. I don't want to disclose that. But anyhow, when we grew up in Hong Kong, honestly, when we talk about Hak Yan Bak Wai, we don't feel any uncomfortable because, hey, otherwise how am I going to describe we are different? So the color is just the color, right? And white is also the color. But the problem right now that I have seen, and this is the question for you, when white wants something, I'm sorry, I have to talk about the color, otherwise it's kind of difficult. When white wants something, hey, come on, join us. Now we become alliance. When Black wants something, they want us now. We become that too. So when you have the topics, I was like, that's exactly what I feel is really complicated. Because why? Right now, honestly, I follow Honorable Carla Wong. My daughter wants also to be a lawyer. It's actually an UGA studied freshman. So you fight so hard to get in there. You are the number one. We know it, okay? But the thing is this. When somebody with your own color go up there, let's say we are helping the white people because of a vote, you get up there. All of a sudden, everything turned white. You don't see other color. When you have the Black people get up there, now everybody turned Black. And I just don't understand when you, okay, this is seriously because I'm in a big organization. I have seen the people get up there. It's not trying to lend a hand to get the other people go to their level. They're thinking about the black fighting with the black, the white fighting with the white, okay? But all you want is upper level. But they never think about is, where am I? How do I get here? How to help each other? And I don't want to have something here like alliance. We're not going to be any alliance. We need to work together as one unit because our blood is all red. There's no other color unless you tell me you have it, okay? Why are we still talking about this? We should work together, not about white or not about black. It's all about
The system
human.
has pit us against each other. We need to recognize the power structure that's creating.
So I want to ask you, because I like her a lot, Doc. You talk about the food, because I'm a foodie. So you tell me, how do you think this can help us? With what kind of alliance? Not the black alliance or white alliance. What kind of alliance?
I think that's an excellent question, and thank you for all the life that you brought to the microphone. I think it's really important that we have to assess what our goals are. And when we look at sort of the Eastern values that have been brought to this country and how they're undervalued or devalued in this country, so what success looks like in this country may absolutely fly in the face of what success looks like in Eastern countries. I often joke with my students that in some South American countries, there's not a word for orphan. It doesn't exist. Because if there's a child and there's an adult, that child will be cared for, right? But in our capitalist structure, our goals look different. So the conversation has to start with aligning our goals. And our goals cannot be based on a white capitalist structure. Now that's tough. That's tough. That's dismantling everything we've ever been taught, ever. Everything. It's literally turning it on its head. But that is the only way that we'll be able to get commonality in our goals. Because otherwise, it's always about the first place finish. And we can't all be first place. Nobody remembers second.
Thank you.
Sir, if you have a
Good
question?
afternoon. First and foremost, I want to say thank you very much, Crystal, for putting together such a marvelous production. Oh, thank you, sir. Appreciate that. Let me repeat what I said. Thank you, Crystal, for putting together such a marvelous production and having such a colorful group of people here for this discussion this afternoon, because I saw a preview of it before online, but there's nothing quite like seeing it with a live audience, and this has been quite an amazing event to attend. What I wanted to say, what I wanted to address and ask one question about is, when we look at hierarchy, and with Asians coming to America wanting to align themselves more with the Euro-American culture as opposed to the Afro-American culture, I'm reminded of my time when I was in Korea, and I was there as a lecturer with the University of Maryland, and my first time at a social function, I come inside, and it's dark inside, and there's this guy who's breakdancing, and he's got these moves, and he's grooves, and this style that is just so amazing. And when the lights come up, he's Korean. Similarly, when I was in Okinawa, Japan, there was an African-American gentleman who I become friends with and his Japanese wife. They opened up what was known then as the Seoul Sushi restaurant near Kadena Air Force Base. It was never, ever empty. It was by locals as well as the military. They conversed on that place on a regular basis. There was another friend of mine who lived in Tokyo who was married to a Japanese woman, and they had a place that sold hip-hop attire. He would tell me, I get a shipment in on Thursday, and by Friday afternoon, my shelves are empty. So when we talk about the perception of Asians of African Americans in America versus Asians of African Americans outside of America, it's drastically different. So I just wanted to bring that one point out. And the last point I wanted to make is that the greatest athlete of the 20th century took a strong stance against an illegal, racist, immoral war that was never declared in Southeast Asia. And when I was in Vietnam, I was approached by a gentleman who actually was a little bit older than myself, who said to me, Muhammad Ali, Muhammad Ali, Muhammad Ali, and he embraced me. I didn't even know him. He just embraced me because he found out that I was American, and he just connected me with Muhammad Ali. So I just wanted to say that there is a greater recognition and respect and appreciation that are paid to African Americans within the Asian community than you'll ever see here in the United States.
Thank you for sharing
Right, thank
that.
you. And we have about 5 minutes left for questions, so I'm going to go to the
Comments, we would
Other
love to
all,
hear
yes.
all your comments.
I'll make this as quick as I can. My name's Long Tran. I'm finishing my first year as a representative in the Georgia legislature. So we're going to talk about power. It's the most diverse legislature ever in Georgia, with its first Asian American minority whip named Sam Park. We have far too many firsts that still needs to happen in Georgia. As this diversity grows, we're going to see in Georgia become a minority-majority state. And with that, the power structure within the Georgia legislature is going to change. This year, we've seen bills that target Black communities to put Black folks into jail more, prevent Hispanics or undocumented immigrants from attaining higher education, and perpetuating Chinese Americans as foreigners. And as these type of bills go during what I consider the current gold rush, right now for every unemployed Georgian, there's 5 high-paying jobs. We have a lot of jobs here that we need to fill the labor, yet we have all these horrible policies. Anyway, so as we get to that majority-minority, 180 seats in the legislature means the Black community is going to lose some of its seats at the table, so to speak. And we are very intentional right now to make sure that the First Asian Caucus, First Hispanic Caucus, the Black Caucus are working together. We're being very intentional, but that will have strains. Could you comment on that?
I just want to be able to hear more stories because I think we're never going to get through everything.
Okay.
If we could
Yes.
just hear some comments.
yes.
Hi, yeah, my name is Anne-Marie Logarta and I represent the Filipino-American community. So my question is really in terms of your film and the availability of this film, are you going to go out into the different Asian American communities and show it in its, I guess, this original version versus, I think you mentioned that there's a shortened version available or going to be
On
available.
PBS, national.
So I guess the goal, my question is, would you be going out to the different communities and how are we
If
going
you'll
to?
have me, I'll go.
that.
Because
Okay.
it's all
Thank
about
you.
conversation. So thank you for that. Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Bin Laniao, and I'm a retired art professor and also filmmaker. Artist Jenny from Chinatown American. After I watched your film, I understand more why some Chinese think they are white and why they're against black. Really, your film is good. Let me more critique think. And because it's not happened in the United States and also happened in China. Because I have the experience when just 2012, I invite my friends, he's black, he's professor. We went to my college in China to presentation. And because before they don't know the name is black, when he arrived with me at the college, and my school just rejected, they said we don't have a translate. And they found many reasons. I said, I will do the translate. I said, he is the best art professor. So after his lecture, everybody liked it. He's very, it's a very, art educator. I think people can change if they know that. You think, Christian, when I ask her, you think this is part in the Chinese culture? About Chinese culture people? Because I went to Black Lives Matter, I got a lot of criticism. People said, oh, you found a husband in the Black Lives Matter? So I said, I explained what is Black Lives Matter. I said, the people just same like us. I really appreciate your film. Really, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And yes, Chinese are very racist against their own kind. We all know that. But, again, a lot of cultures do that. But why do we do that? I mean, I think we just need to talk about that. But yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for opening up a global perspective on racism because it is global. Yes, please.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Ramona Houston, and I'm an American historian, and my research focuses on African American and Mexican American history and relations. and I'm also a social impact strategist. And so through this documentary, Crystal, you have exemplified the power of storytelling, and I really commend you for that. You've managed to put the full context of white supremacy within the context of racism, classism, sexism, the economic exploitation of the Black community, the hierarchy of race, how families perpetuate biases, sexism, gender, segregation, all these things, and the truth about how white power structures actually operate. And so my question is, what was your process as a filmmaker in coming to figure out how to frame racism in its complexity? Your title is excellent. And so I'm really curious about that. And because most of the time when we try to analyze racism, we look very linear, very simplistic. And it's a lot of isms and factors that feed into it. And you told it in a way, in a story, in a way that people can truly understand.
Thank you so much for that question. And I know we're so pressed for time, but I hope if you don't mind us extending just a few more minutes so we can carry with this. Do we all know what the color line refers to? Just to clarify, does I should have your historian to talk about that. W.E.B. Du Bois's famous words, and that everything is based on the color line. And so blurring it for me is complicating it. And what I mean by blurring it, to your question, is I take a very feminist perspective, and not to throw people off and oh no, that women's stuff, but feminism is really a multiple layered look into silent spaces, things that slip through the cracks of history, of things that we don't see, and question why it's erased, why things are silenced. And so from that perspective, I've been able to see so many things. And I love this analogy of two trees. They seem to have different fruit, but when you look in the ground, what happens to these trees? The roots start intertwining, and they start feeding off each other. Have you seen those TED Talks about trees talking to each other? They thrive off of the diversity of the different species, and that's I apply that approach because it is the beautiful metaphor of how we can entangle our histories and different aspects of learning, right? So entanglement, just keep that blur in your head. I think we can learn a lot more. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much. And unfortunately, that has to be our last question because we're at the end of our time. But the panelists will be available during our reception. So if you have any questions, I'm sure everyone, including myself, would be happy to speak to you more about the film. But let's give our panelists a round of applause.
Oh, thank you. Happy to talk to you outside. Please don't go away.
Okay, don't go away yet, everybody. So we want to thank our generous sponsors for underwriting the event. Bronze sponsor, Petra Co. and the Co. Family Foundation, DN Foods. Director sponsors, Georgia Power, Tech Top USA, Chen Lee Education and Cultural Foundation, GAPABA. Diversity sponsors, Chinese Business Association of Atlanta, CBAA, Hong Kong Association of Atlanta, Hong Kong Dragon Boat Festival, Paula Wong, Lehigh. Next, a treat for the year. Sophie Scher of the Wei Yin Studio and her students, Wendy and Amy, will play the guzheng, an ancient Chinese string instrument that is plugged to create relaxing music. And a treat for the stomach. So join us in the lobby for light refreshments while you continue to listen to our live concert. I want to thank and acknowledge Jeannie Lin. Jeannie was responsible for planning and implementing this event. She took the deep dive and did the research for this panel discussion, obtained all of these panelists for you. She worked really, really hard, and I'm glad it's over. So please join us. A NACA board member, please come up to the stage. They want to take a quick photograph with our panelists. So enjoy the reception. Thank you, everybody.